I take great pride in both my Roma heritage and identity and Roma culture. And I also take pride in the heritage that has been carried on through generations in my family. My family is very interesting. I'm coming from a mixed family of Szinto circus performers. And also Romunglo or Roma gypsy, Hungarian gypsy musicians. The Hungarian Roma movement that started in Central Europe in the late 60s is extremely important when we talk about Roma history, because it was really the Roma cultural movement and activist movement that first started to raise our attention towards these precious moments that Roma together have experienced in Hungary and in Central Europe. And I think it was also their achievement that we started realizing how the Roma in Hungary, for example, have been such integral part of Hungarian history. How Hungarian musicians have been already engaged in the 1848 freedom fights in Hungary. How Hungarian traditional occupations of gun making and metalworking have been integral to the historical events in Hungary since the early 19th century. I think that we have some traditions, some Roma traditions that are very important in my close community. For example, there is this tradition of, and that has also inspired my work as a contemporary art curator, which might sound strange if I say it this way, but maybe if I bring an example, it will be easier to understand. There is this traditional jurisdictional model in the traditional Roma communities, which is called a divan. Divan is also a name often used in Central and Southern Europe for a couch. And it also symbolizes a circle, of the community coming and sitting together. So the divan is basically the community's way of making justice. It is the person who sits out on the divan and tells his subjective story in a certain situation. And then it's the turn of the next member of the community. So we do not dispute aggressively, and we do not make decisions without listening to all aspects of a certain story, of a certain decision to make. So I think this kind of divan is extremely important, and I even apply it in my own, very contemporary and very modern family. To me, especially, those figures who have started, to first express their pride in their Roma identity in the 1960s here in Hungary, they are my true heroes. There was an artist discovered in 1969 called János Balázs, and he was discovered as a naive painter. He was discovered kind of on this wave of the great art history's interest in naive and uneducated painters. So he was discovered on these terms. However, whenever he was asked about his art, he proved that he's extremely educated, he's completely aware of artistic tendencies, and his most important task, his most important mission was to return his knowledge towards the next generations of Roma. There was a Roma painter, Tamás Péli, who also became a party member of the Hungarian Socialist Party in '93. And he was a painter who decided that he will set up a classical painting school like the Renaissance painters. So he had helpers and students in his workshop as a real Renaissance painter. And he painted the Roma mythology. He returned to Tiszadob. Tiszadob was the largest orphanage of Hungary in 1982. And at the Tiszadob castle, where all the Roma orphans were basically deported by the Hungarian government, he painted the largest Hungarian panno. It's 43 square meters. And that panno represents the history of Roma in Hungary. It's an amazing panno. When people step in that space, they are silent and completely amazed. And a lot of little Roma children were having their lunches and breakfasts and dinners in front of this gigantic painting for many years. And from that little dining room came the first Hungarian Roma idol, you know, these talent casting shows that are around the globe, Ibolya Ola. From that room came the first Hungarian Roma artist who ever been educated in the art schools in Hungary, and many other public figures whom are active Roma artists and creators and public figures. I think it's extremely important to give the dignity and to give the attention to the Roma figures who have shaped Roma history. Roma never had the institutions to do so. We do not have printing houses to write books about them. We do not have museums to exhibit history in which they are mentioned properly. We do not have the educational system that gives Roma the proper space in education material. So it would be extremely important to create this kind of institutional system that gives Roma, you know, the opportunity to kind of treasure these precious moments in our history. The memory of the Roma Holocaust has become a battle of the numbers. You know, the researchers, historians, they are very much preoccupied and taking a side on whether, you know, 10,000, 200,000, 250,000 or 500,000 Roma victims were impacted by the Holocaust, and whether they are just collateral damage, you know, or actual targets of the Nazi regime. So I think that all this should be put aside. We know several survivors, and we know, and we have gathered a lot of stories about what has happened to Roma during the Nazi regime. And it's extremely important that we shall not work on canonizing, you know, Roma Holocaust as part of the historical events, or part of the canon of history. I think we should do exactly what the Jewish community has done, in a way that we shall build on the individual and subjective stories. I think that the education on the history of the Roma Holocaust is inevitable in order to understand, you know, the banality of evil. If we wanna work with the term of Hannah Arendt, you know, that we need to understand that Roma have been destroyed and killed, you know, by their own community members or their own village residents and their authorities, and not by these awfully looking, evil looking Nazi people that we can easily distance ourselves from. We also need to recognize that discrimination, anti-Gypsyism, and violence against Roma people is actually happening today. And it's important even for the Roma to understand that our history has been a history of continuous discrimination and continuous attacks and violence, both physical and economic and political, against the Roma people since the 15th century, since the first Roma groups appeared in front of the city gates in Europe. So understanding this history and researching, you know, how to work on Gajo or non-Roma, we say Gajo for the non-Roma people, understanding Gajo and Roma interrelations, I think it would be extremely important to understand this very difficult, heavy and traumatized past, and consider reconciliation. And I think it's important to say that, as Paul Gilroy says, you know, the post-colonial theorist says, you know, it would be extremely important to kind of raise above this trauma deal with this shame in a way that it turns into constructive and productive shame, so we can form these multicultural nations which are not phobic about strangers and foreigners and aliens and Roma anymore. I think it's very important to give to realize this kind of institutional asymmetry and the kind of and not just the institutional but the economic asymmetry in the memory representation, because unless Roma have the proper tools and infrastructure for representation, and this shall be a cultural right, you know. So we could also mention that until this cultural right is not provided for the Roma minority, until then there will always be this kind of tension and imbalance and asymmetry in representations. And that tension, you know, it's kind of traumatizing on the long term, and it creates tension and it creates rage after a while. So it would be extremely important for the Roma to find these precious memories, as I said earlier, you know, and to be able to return these towards the next generations of both Roma and non-Roma. Nikolai Georgia was a Romanian activist. He was also a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe for a long time. You know, founder of the Roma Christ organization in Romania. Kind of like this fatherly figure who had quite large political influence, but his biggest influence is really how he was such an inspirational and fantastic leading figure. He's one of the Romani elders, and he's the person who said that in case you know, Roma culture is an act of playing out Romani identity in different creative and structural methods, then Romani artists perhaps have just as much to say about Romani identity as the politicians or the scientists do. And my other important quote comes from an artist, Chaya Stoica, who was a Holocaust survivor, and she later became an artist, and she drew an unbelievable series about her Holocaust experience in the 3 camps, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen, 200 ink drawings, over 200 ink drawings, and this series she entitled "Even Auschwitz is Afraid," even Death is Afraid of Auschwitz. And at the end of the book, in which she analyzes this series, she says, "I tell you my story because you all have to know that Auschwitz is only sleeping."